Welcome to Concord Matters, a show seeking for concord, agreement in Christian confession. Concord mattered to Jesus and Paul, and so it does to us also. Spend these next 60 minutes as we talk matters of Concord. Concord Matters, a program produced by the Christ-centered leader in confessional broadcasting, worldwide KFUO, online at kfuo.org.
And welcome to Concord Matters, the show where we seek to be of one mind, that is the mind of Christ. And to do that, a couple of Christ-confessing Concordians read through the Book of Concord and discuss what we believe, teach, and confess according to Scripture in our Lutheran Confession of the Faith. On today's show, we are going to start Article 7 from the Epitome of the Formula of Concord, looking at the status of the controversy, that is, what is the issue that needs clear confession with regard to the teaching on the Holy Supper of Christ. I'm your host, Pastor Sean Smith, pastor of the dual parish of Emmanuel West Point and St. Paul's Wine Hill in southern Illinois. My companion confessor in conversation about this article today is Pastor Mark Bestul. He is the pastor of Calvary Lutheran Church in Elgin, Illinois. Pastor Bestul, welcome back to Concord Matters.
Thank you, Pastor Smith. Great to be with you.
All right. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. This is a very, very important article of our Christian confession. Not the chief doctrine, of course, that remains the doctrine of justification. But as we see, everything tends to relate back to that, as obviously everything is tied and united in Christ himself. And this is, as we just celebrated, Holy Week. Had Maundy, Thursday. Christ gives us this precious gift of his own body and blood for the comfort of, for the forgiveness of sins, which brings us great comfort. And of course, confirmed by the miracle of the resurrection, which we celebrated just on Sunday. So a very important thing for us in our Christian life, our confession on the Holy Supper of Christ, the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion. And so we certainly want to jump into what's going on here. I'm going to go ahead and read just the first paragraph. Again, we read from the Concordia, the Lutheran Confessions, a reader's edition of the Book of Concord, available from Concordia Publishing House, the publishing arm of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And this is, once again, Epitome of the Formula of Concord, Article 7, the Holy Supper of Christ, paragraph 1. The Zwinglian teachers are not to be counted among the theologians who receive, acknowledge, and profess the Augsburg Confession. They separated from our theologians at the very time when this confession was presented. Yet they are advancing themselves and are attempting, under the name of this Christian confession, to spread their error. Therefore, we also intend to make a necessary statement about this controversy in which we have judged that the Church of Christ should be instructed. All right, so Pastor Bestul, go ahead, lay out for us here. First, who are we talking about when we're talking about the Zwinglian teachers? Like, what groups would that even still include today? But also historically, of course, we want to lay that out. And then why would they not be counted among those of the Augsburg Confession, i.e. the Lutherans?
Sure. So the Zwinglian teachers, it's an interesting first phrase because today we probably don't know. I think the typical Christian probably doesn't know the name Zwingli as much as they would know the name Calvin, for example. And yet really this does start all the way back in the 1520s with a man named Ulrich Zwingli, who was prominent at the same time as Luther. You have back in the late 1520s, you have the Marburg Colloquy, in which Luther and Zwingli sat down, and Zwingli's counterparts were two guys named Bucer and Ecolampadius. And then, of course, Luther had Melanchthon at his side and other theologians at his side. And they basically sat down to say, can we agree on points of Christian doctrine? And you rightly said at the outset that the fundamental point, if you will, the foundational point of Christian doctrine is justification. And yet you might say the point at which all of this either visibly comes together or visibly falls apart really is the Lord's Supper. And And this showcased itself in the Marburg colloquy, when Luther and Zwingli basically agreed on the first 13 or 14 points of doctrine, or at least thought they did. Then they got to the issue of the Lord's Supper, and in describing and discussing the issue of the Lord's Supper, not only do they see that they disagree there on the Lord's Supper, but that also sort of snowballs back into all the other points they thought they agreed upon. So in the first generation, you've got sort of Luther versus Zwingli, if you will. And then also the counterparts of Zwingli. And Luther's got some great writings for people who love to read Luther's works, some great writings in his own personal writings against Zwingli, writings like that the words of "This is my body" still stand firm against the fanatics, things like that. Then there's sort of a second generation, if you will, and that's where Calvin comes to prominence. Calvin is really more prominent. He's sort of coming on the scene as Luther dies. And he's sort of second generation. Philip Melanchthon's sort of what's referred to as his Variata, the second time that he sort of edits his Augsburg Confession, if you will, thinking that it's his own right to edit it, gives Calvin some wiggle room in there for his view of the supper, and we can get to those views in a second here. And then there's sort of a third generation. So you got Zwingli in the first generation, Calvin in the second generation, and then the third generation are those who are sort of followers of Calvin after Calvin dies. I can't remember the year exactly. I want to say maybe he dies at 1555 or something like that. And after Calvin dies, a third generation come into play. And this is the generation that had sort of become so prominent even in Lutheran circles that they had almost convinced the Lutheran electors to throw out all of the genuine Lutheran preachers who were preaching the bodily presence of Christ in the sacrament, to almost throw them out of the pulpits and basically put in Calvinist preachers, those who did not believe in the bodily presence of Christ in the sacrament. So you've really got those three generations that build up to this issue. Now, to your second question, why are they not to be counted among those who agree with the Augsburg Confession's teaching regarding the supper? It really comes down to the question of, is the body and blood of Christ in with and under the bread and the wine? When we receive the bread and the wine, are we also receiving the body and blood of Christ? Lutherans, of course, would say yes, by all means, we are receiving the body and blood of Christ. Whereas the Protestants would say, well, no, or well, maybe in a way, but they definitely would not say yes in the bodily manner in which Lutherans believe that when you place the bread on the tongue, there also is the body of Christ, and when you drink the wine, there also is the blood of Christ. Protestants would not agree with those statements, and they would have their own variations, if you will, on trying to explain it in a more rational way. And that's what this article, in a sense, denounces, is that rationalism. But that's where this article sets apart the Lutheran teaching of the Augsburg Confession as opposed to these Zwinglian teachers.
So it says there, and you were hitting this, that they're advancing themselves and are attempting under the name of this Christian confession to spread their error. And you covered really well how they were advancing and even getting pretty forceful with this. There's a term that often gets brought up in connection with this article that I wonder if you could identify for us as it'll be helpful for us in understanding here, called Crypto-Calvinism. How does that tie in here?
Sure. Crypto is sort of the idea of hidden, hiding. When you get into the third generation, the 1560s and 1570s, under the name of Lutheran, these men who were in the pulpits were taking the name Lutheran, and even earlier, at one point, of course, with the original Reformation, you've got Rome versus Lutherans, and I think a lot of folks who were not necessarily theologically equal to the Lutheran view still found safe haven and still found safety and freedom in the Lutheran confession, freedom from Rome. And as they do, then as the generations go on, even though they do not hold to the Lutheran view, they will nevertheless take the Lutheran name because it means safety. So you get to the third generation here, and you've now got a more widespread non-Lutheran view of the sacrament among preachers and teachers of the gospel who are saying, we now have a chance actually to overtake, for example, Saxony, to overtake sort of the heartland of the Lutheran Reformation by our very subtle views and under the surface views. And I don't have all my resource materials with me. This whole shelter in place has been sort of odd, so I don't have them all. And I didn't get a chance to look up the exact story and history behind how this was found out. But basically, if I remember correctly, a letter fell into a letter between, it might have even been Melanchthon's own son-in-law, who was one of the core preachers or something like that, if I remember the story correctly, a letter that was sent back and forth between these subtle Crypto-Calvinists as they were trying to place into the hands of the elector of Saxony and trying to get him to understand, hey, follow us, follow our teaching. That letter fell into the quote-unquote wrong hands. It fell into the hands of a genuine Lutheran preacher who then showed it to the prince or the elector and showed that they were very intentionally trying to get the leadership of these electoral colonies, trying to get them to believe that the Calvinist view was actually the Lutheran view, trying to get them to take into their own hands the Calvinist catechisms, things like that. And therefore this name Crypto-Calvinist comes into play, that though they readily denied the Lutheran confession, they were willing historically to take the name Lutheran with the hopes of driving out the actual Lutheran confession from the preaching and teaching of the land.
Yeah, so that's really helpful. I mean, at stake here is what is the theology at work? What is the teaching that is coming for the comfort of consciences and receiving the forgiveness of sins? Of course, in C.F.W. Walther, first president of Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, he spends a couple of his theses kind of returning to this idea and talking about, even improper teaching that's going on by the Crypto-Calvinists and so forth is really what's at stake is a matter of proper distinction of law and gospel. And so certainly the proper and clear confession of this is at stake. And you also brought up here how, at the time of the Augsburg Confession, it was kind of Rome versus the Lutherans, and Luther himself at the center of that, of course, although it's the theology that he professed. But back in Article 10 of the Augsburg Confession, where they deal with that confession of what the Lutheran theologians are teaching and so forth, as the Augsburg Confession is against Rome, it's probably the shortest, I think it is the shortest article in the whole Augsburg Confession. I mean, it's just a couple of lines. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like, and we're going to get into as we continue to go over the next couple of weeks through this article, how clearly we still want to distinguish ourselves from the transubstantiation and view of the Roman Catholic Church. But is it fair to say then at the real heart of this article, as we get to it in the Formula of Concord, is we're focusing in on basically all the other Reformed and how we are not in alignment with them, and we have a greater disparity. Perhaps I might be going too far here. I don't know what your thoughts are, but probably a greater disparity in terms of our teaching and confession of what's going on in the sacrament than we see even present in the Augsburg Confession when it comes to against Rome. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. In the Augsburg Confession, I think part of the reason that it's so short, and you're right, it's 3 or 4 lines in the Augsburg Confession, Article 10. The reason it's so short is because the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics agree that the body and blood of Christ are truly present. In fact, just looking it up here real quickly, the phrase is, our churches teach that the body and blood of Christ are truly present and distributed to those who eat the Lord's Supper. That's it. That's it. And both Rome and the Lutherans would agree on that. Now, there's some disagreement in the idea of transubstantiation, but that disparity, like you rightly say, is much smaller. And Luther even at times says, if they don't want to believe that the bread and the wine are still present, that's not as big of an issue as the problems that the Roman Catholics have with their understanding of the use and the benefit of the supper. But in terms of what's actually present, there's a huge disparity between the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans versus the Protestants. And so here in the Formula of Concord, which is really the document, if somebody's just getting started on the Book of Concord, one of the things I try to point out to them is that some of the earlier documents are sort of quote unquote against Rome, and the Formula of Concord is sort of quote unquote against the Protestants. Now that's a gross generalization, but that's maybe a helpful way of understanding that here the focus of the discussion on the Lord's Supper is how do we show or how do we confess that we are not the same as the Calvinists, that we are not the same as the Reformed, that there is a difference between these supposed two sides, one side being Reformed, the other side being Roman Catholic. So the Roman Catholics often accuse the Lutherans of having sort of a Reformed view of the supper, and the Reformed accuse the Lutherans of having sort of a quasi-transubstantiation view of the supper. They refer to it as consubstantiation. That's not true either. And the Lutherans are sort of, in a sense, stuck in the middle of saying, no, we've got the scriptural view, and the disparity between these other points needs to be upheld, if you will, in both ways. So the Augsburg Confession against Rome, but this great disparity on saying the Reformed don't even believe that Christ is bodily present in the sacrament. At least we can rejoice in that with Rome and with the Eastern Orthodox, but with the Protestants we can't rejoice in that together.
Yeah, I'm with you. I often recommend a great place to start reading for kind of those who are interested in what Lutheranism is about is actually the epitome of the Formula of Concord. Just because, the Augsburg Confession, very, very clear document, very good document. I think you should read the entire Book of Concord, honestly. And the two churches I serve here in Southern Illinois have the unaltered Augsburg Confession as a part of their official name, even. So I'm not dismissing those out of hand at any cost. And certainly the small called articles from Luther's own hand, very, very helpful, clear confession of what we Lutherans believe, teach, and confess. But I think sometimes the epitome of the Formula of Concord is just this beautiful document that just sets forth this is what we believe, teach, and confess as Lutheran Christians. And I am with you that it really distinguishes us more from, the Reformed, the other Reformed groups than it does from Rome. And I think that can be really helpful in our day and age because there's this idea that persists in the Lutheran Church and so forth too, where we always want to be careful in terms of our practices, and this will certainly come up in later articles in terms of our practices, because the people will always say, oh, that's too Roman Catholic, and we don't do that, and things like that. But even C.F.W. Walther, first president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, says, no, as a matter of fact, when we recover things that are truly Lutheran, that accusation will come just simply because those were the good things that we wanted to keep from Roman Catholicism, and we never had any problem with those. And perhaps what we should be more worried about, especially in our American context, I think, is it's just so dominant in what I call American evangelicalism, is how Reformed teaching is among us. And so I wonder if you could just spend a few moments here too, is this Crypto-Calvinism still an issue for us that we face? Let's just limit it to, and I'm not looking for specifics here, or anything of that nature. Well, I mean, not specifics like don't call out any churches or anything like that.
Sure.
That's better left to our theologians and our ecclesiastical heads to kind of have those sorts of things. But what are ways that perhaps Crypto-Calvinism is still among us in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod today, or still a threat to us, I might say?
Sure. Part of this gets into what you were just talking about in terms of, is the danger nowadays for us in our land to, quote unquote, look and sound more like Rome, or quote unquote, look and sound more like the American evangelical. I suppose you'll get into that quite a bit when you get into the discussion on customs and practices in Article 10. But even here in the Holy Supper, that distinction shows up in various ways. You'll probably get into this in the affirmative and negative statements, but what about issues like open communion versus closed communion? Who receives the benefits of the sacrament? That issue of open communion versus closed communion is an issue of do you hold the Protestant or the Reformed view that says, well, there's nothing here that can harm me anyway, or do you hold a Lutheran view? One that I think is very circumstantial here, and in our unique circumstance, one that people ought to think about quite a bit, and you'll have a great opportunity to discuss this in future weeks, is think of how the sacramental churches, Rome and the Lutheran churches, have a much more difficult time with the shelter in place than the Reformed do. That the Reformed practice says, well, our worship is basically spiritual, and therefore, if that means we can't be together for it, we can still think about it together in sort of the spiritual form of worship. Whereas the Lutheran churches and the Roman Catholic churches rightly say, well, how do we benefit from the body and blood of Christ if we can't be at the altar of God to receive the sacrament? And so the sacramental churches, I think, have a much harder time with this shelter in place than do the churches that don't necessarily think that the sacraments play as big a role in terms of the worship and spiritual life of the church.
I think that's really dead on target, especially what we're going to get into as we start to get the theology of that's at stake here when we get into the next paragraphs under the status of the controversy of, for Reformed, and I think I'm so with you on this that when it's just a spiritual gathering, that is in view of what it is that we even do. And there's other things that come in, as you say, in terms of the practices, but even the view of what it is that we're doing, are we just giving praise to God, or are we actually receiving God in the very midst of us, that distinguishes us from American evangelicalism. But just this view that it's only a spiritual thing that we're gathering for. Well, yeah, then you can just kind of do that at home, and through the means of media and things of that nature just as easily. But for us in our Lutheran position, that when we talk about the body of Christ, that contains our gathering together, but also our gathering, and chiefly our gathering together to receive the body of Christ in, with, and under the bread and wine, which is truly present there. Well, yeah, that's a lot more difficult for us to do in these sorts of means, and a lot more to uncover there. Certainly, I am in agreement with you. I'll have to kind of throw this teaser out there that when we get to the negative statements, certainly we'll want to come back to a lot of those sorts of contemporary applications that we see some of that theology at work. But I think that's enough setup for right now. We're going to go ahead and take a break, but please join us right after this as we continue to talk about the status of the controversy.
In this season of life, when everything seems to be constantly changing, one thing remains the same: the promises of God given to us in the Word of Christ. I'm Sarah Gulseth, a digital media specialist for KFUO Radio, here at home in my spare room, to remind you all the ways you can hear the Word of Christ on KFUO Radio from wherever you call home. Our daily broadcast at kfuo.org includes talk programs, sacred music, daily chapel services, weekend worship services, and Bible studies. Our on-demand library includes many of our broadcast programs, in addition to podcasts from LCMS partners. You and your family can stream KFUO Radio at kfuo.org or on the TuneIn app. You can even ask your smart speaker to play KFUO Radio. You can also pull up your favorite podcast app and search for KFUO Radio to find all of our available podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest updates, as well as daily Bible verses and hymns. We are KFUO Radio, Christ for you, anytime, anywhere, at kfuo.org.
And welcome back to Concord Matters as we continue to talk with Pastor Mark Bestul as he is in Elgin, Texas. I maybe probably overemphasized that now, but just want to make sure I pronounce the name of the place that our wonderful pastors that contribute here serve. So we are continuing to discuss Article 7 of the Epitome of the Formula of Concord, the Holy Supper of Christ, and realized that as we went into break there, I had asked Pastor Bestul about, and he gave us great history. I really liked it, broke it down as we're kind of looking at the third generation of these Zwinglian teachers and so forth here. But just before we move into these next paragraphs where we start to get the theology that's at work and where we distinguish there and so forth, I need to get from you, give us an idea of what are some of the church bodies, at least that we would see today, that have kind of come about out of these Zwinglian teachers. And I'm just going to go ahead and throw out there that I see it as kind of a spectrum of churches, and kind of give us an idea of maybe where they fall along in terms of the spectrum there.
Yeah, you're right. And when we mentioned in the last segment that we know so well the name Calvin as opposed to the name Zwingli, and perhaps the differences in their views are differences that are also seen among the spectrum of churches, where you can't always pinpoint where along the spectrum, even between Zwingli and Calvin, are some of these churches. So, churches that are strict, quote unquote, Calvinists, the Orthodox Reformed, the Presbyterians, those would certainly hold to more of an understanding of the idea that that there is something spiritually happening. It's simply not the body and blood of Christ there present in the sacrament as much as you're eating. And as you're eating, there's a spiritual eating of Christ in heaven. And you'll get to those things as we go along here. Whereas those church bodies that would be more of the other side of that spectrum of, well, no, there's nothing here. It's just a memorial meal. You might have churches in that, like the Baptist churches, although some of the Baptist churches, even up here in Northern Illinois, some of the Baptist churches hold sort of something in between Zwingli and Calvin, and you almost just have to go to each of these churches and say, well, what's your actual view on this? The community churches are another one. The sort of the big box mega churches. You'll get everything from this is a memorial meal to this is a spiritual eating, and so you can have that. One community church will say this, and because they're not really part of a church body, the other community church down the street will say that. So it's really difficult to pinpoint everything. But I think generally what you can sort of say is, if they tend toward the Baptist side, you will see a lot of strict memorial meal ordinance type of a thing. And if you go more toward the Presbyterian Reform side, you'll see more of the spiritual eating. Either way, I always find it interesting that you can sort of tell when you look at the different church catalogs or the bulletins or whatever. One of the big lines is "Do this in remembrance of me." Right? I mean that's on all the bulletin covers. It's on all of the engraved into the front of altars. Sometimes not because it's wrong; those are the words of Christ too, but because it emphasizes sort of the memorial meal aspect of this, as opposed to this is my body, this is my blood. So it's really difficult to necessarily pinpoint just by a particular name. But as you start to see some of their conduct, some of their, what phraseology they might focus on in the words of institution, that sort of gives you a clue. Is this memorial meal? Is this spiritual eating? Sadly, neither of them are the body and blood of Christ.
I think one of the other things that I'll tag in there as one of the clues of kind of where they fall in that spectrum is how often do they do it? Right. So,
right. Good point. Yes.
If they only do it, a few times a year or things like that, then they probably fall on that memorial meal. We just do this simply because Christ said to do it and to remember him when we did it, when we do it rather. But those who kind of give, it's a spiritual presence, kind of more in lines with Calvin there and so forth in that Presbyterian view. They'll be a little closer to us in terms of frequency, certainly because they think that there is something going on there, but it's only in a spiritual sense, right? And so we'll continue to lay out the theology, but go ahead with that, yeah.
Yeah, especially here we just finished Holy Week, and like you say, those who only do it every so often, Maundy, Thursday, right? There's your one time a year, perhaps, where you do this in remembrance of me. There are some churches up here, in fact, that will make sure that they celebrate Maundy, Thursday just for that reason, and so they definitely highlight that one time a year eating, and that sort of tells you, their view of it is a memorial meal. Sometimes I even wonder, where does the phrase "the Last Supper" come from? Does it actually come from the text of the Scriptures, or is it more this idea of do this in remembrance of me because it was the last time that Jesus ate with his disciples, as opposed to the institution of a new thing rather than the last opportunity of sort of an old thing? Here's the institution of the new covenant. This is my body, this is my blood. And yet for many people, it's almost a sorrowful time of a Last Supper because this is the last time he does this, and therefore we're going to remember that. And therefore once a year or maybe a couple times a year, the memorial meal theology will have the supper as a way of remembering that. So you're absolutely right. The frequency is another giveaway.
There's probably a great PhD project in there somewhere too. Yeah, if someone's looking for an idea. I mean, because you could also view it in this way too, right? That it's the last of the Passover meals because Jesus institutes the new, and so it's not something we would necessarily entirely be opposed to, but maybe a little deeper than we need to on this show, especially for the current controversy that we need clear confession on. So let's go ahead and jump forward into these paragraphs then and start to begin to unfold what is the theology at work here that differentiates us. So again, we're reading from the Concordia, the Lutheran Confessions Reader's Edition of the Book of Concord from CPH. This is Epitome of the Formula of Concord, Article 7, picking up with paragraph 2, status of the controversy, the chief controversy between our teaching and that of the Sacramentarians regarding this article. You know what? I'm not even going to read it because now we have a new term introduced to us, and it's going to come up several times here in this paragraph. So before I read it, now they've thrown Sacramentarians at us. Go ahead and identify. What are we talking about with there?
The Sacramentarians, if I remember my history correctly on this, and again, here's the deficiency of our shelter in place, but if I remember correctly, it's they were labeled as Sacramentarians because they use the term sacramental to mean less than the body and blood of Christ actually being present. That yes, he was present in a sacramental way, and that for them meant a spiritual way, that he's not, actually there with his body and blood, but that we in our worshipful nature spiritually feast on him. As opposed to the true presence, right? We got that in the Augsburg Confession that that Rome and the Lutherans agree that he is truly present, and they say, well, he's sacramentally present, and out of that, I believe, comes the term sacramentarian. Of course, as the terminology changes over time, I think nowadays we Lutherans would probably be very comfortable saying, well, we refer to the sacramental presence of Christ, and we know by that we mean that he is there not locally or physiologically, where you're going to put the host underneath a microscope and find the DNA of Jesus, and yet he is there simply because he says, this is my body, and the word makes it so, and therefore we say, yes, he is sacramentally there in his very body and blood. When they originally used that term, they meant it to be less than the true presence. And so nowadays it might even be something where Lutherans get used to the phrase bodily presence as opposed to true presence, because what does the word true mean? Some people can mean spiritual, other people can mean sacramental, other people can mean physiologically or locally present, and those are all terms you'll get into, I suppose, as you get into the affirmative statements.
Yeah, I think real briefly we can hit here. One of the helpful things about the Reader's Edition of the Book of Concord is it has a glossary in the back. And while they don't have sacramentarian in the glossary back there, they do have sacrament. And so I do want to just briefly read the first part of this. It says, a sacrament is a sacred act instituted by God in which God himself has joined his word of promise to a visible element, and by which he offers, gives, and seals the forgiveness of sins earned by Christ. And then it goes on to say, by this definition, there are two sacraments, Holy Baptism and the Lord's Supper, and then sometimes Holy Absolution gets thrown in there, and we've talked about all that on this show before too as well. And so what, and I brought this up to you before we started recording and so forth off the air. I think it's interesting that today we would be more prone as Lutheran Christians to hold on to that term sacrament, right, and want it connected with us. Because, again, I think American evangelicalism is so influential in our land that, kind of that broad term, that now there's this general, probably more the memorial meal end of the spectrum where they just, we just do this in remembrance of Christ, and that there's nothing sacramental going on there at all. But historically, in calling them the sacramentarians, there's an editor's note here in the Reader's edition of the Book of Concord that confirms what you were saying there. So it says, Reformed Christians deriving their theology from the teachings of Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin deny that Christ is truly present in, with, and under the bread and wine. They speak of his spiritual or symbolic presence. And so again, as kind of things develop, especially under Zwingli's followers and so forth, it tends to just, again, probably a PhD research, and probably things have been done here, is kind of the development of that theology, how it got so far away from kind of even seeing a spiritual presence at work there, and just kind of just doing it because Jesus said so, sort of thing. But when we're talking about the sacramentarians, though, we would probably claim that for ourselves and hold on to that tightly today. Here we are meaning those who we are opposed with in terms of their theology, right?
Yeah, I think a helpful word there in the explanation is that word symbolic, because if I remember correctly, when Luther is writing against Zwingli in his personal writings against him, there's an argument over this word symbol. Lutherans are very comfortable speaking of the sacraments as the symbols of the church at times, and yet we mean something completely different than a Zwinglian would mean. The Zwinglian would mean if it's a symbol, then it's empty of that which it's representing. Whereas Luther would say, no, if it's a symbol, it's carrying that which it, in a sense, represents. And so I think that's one of the underlying issues here is just because the bread and the wine are a visual, quote-unquote, symbol, does that mean that they don't carry the body and blood of Christ, or does it mean that they do carry it?
That's a great reminder of something I bring up on the show a lot, because my wife brings it up like every night at the dinner table. Words mean things, right? And what is it that we mean by these words? So that's really important to lay out there. All right. So now that we kind of have an identification of what sacramentarians are, where they, and that's not us. So we will dig into then these paragraphs. So again, picking up with paragraph 2 here. Question. In the Holy Supper are the true body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, A, truly and essentially present, B, distributed with the bread and wine, and C, received with the mouth by all those who use this sacrament, whether they are worthy or unworthy, godly or ungodly, believing or unbelieving. Are they received by the believing for consolation and life, but by the unbelieving for judgment? The sacramentarians say no. We say yes. All right, so go ahead and break that down. There's really a couple questions there. So it begins, at least in the Reader's Edition, question, colon, right? And then it lays out what you would think would be one question, but there's really a couple questions, but one and the same point going on there.
Yeah, so the writers give us these 3 bullet points, A, B, and C. Are the body and blood of Christ received truly, or are they truly and essentially present? There's point A. So again, for the Zwinglian, they would say, well, Christ is present. Calvin would say Christ is present, but in the same way that he says, "Lo, I am with you always," sort of this generic omnipresence. But he would say that the body and blood of Christ are not thereby present. And we would say, well, no, he is truly and essentially present. This gets back to Augsburg Confession 10. Distributed with the bread and the wine. Again, if his body and blood is not present, then the sacramentarians would say when you're handing out or when you're distributing bread and wine, you're only distributing bread and wine. If the bread falls on the floor, if the wine is spilled, no harm, no foul, because you're just distributing bread and wine. Whereas the Lutherans would say, no, if the bread falls on the floor, you don't step on it, you pick it up and you reverently consume it. If the wine spills on the floor, you don't just find the easiest way to mop it up, but rather you treat it reverently. In fact, there's that story of Luther late in life when he was quite ill and spilled some of the wine on the floor, and he got down, as the story goes, got down on all fours and licked it up as a reminder that this is the blood of Christ. And so Lutherans treat it with great reverence. Going to customs and practices, this is why Lutherans historically have knelt for the Lord's Supper, as opposed to the Reformed historically not kneeling, because the Reformed said, why would we kneel? There's nothing present here. And the Lutherans said, no, there is something present. It's the body and blood of Christ, the body and blood of our God. Why would we not kneel before our God? So that's point B. Point C, received with the mouth by all who use the sacrament. Now you sort of get into the issues of, is it Christian love to have open communion because you're wanting to invite everybody? Or is it Christian love to have closed communion because you are wanting to safeguard unbelievers from harming themselves? You can't harm yourself if there's nothing present other than bread and wine. But if the body and blood of Christ are present, then, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, it can be taken to one's harm if they do not properly discern the body and blood. And so these three bullet points are big bullet points for showing this big distinction between the Zwinglian view and the Lutheran view of the supper.
I think that's really well laid out for us. And one of the things that I want to highlight here too is what you brought in there in terms of it plays out in our practices. And you brought in, open versus closed communion, or, what happens if some spills and so forth. But historically, and this can get really sensitive, and here I always want to remind, Concord Matters and KFUO Radio are not your church, and we are not your pastors, unless you're one of my parishioners or Pastor Bestul's parishioners, in which case come talk to us if you are listening to this. Right. But here we can talk about these things, but I want to not be used against your pastor or anything like that. So I want to be very clear on that point before I bring this up. But again, when American evangelicalism and just kind of this reform view of what even goes on in the supper, especially in the development, as they're just so numerous in the United States as the United States grows and develops. And I can even look at the history of my area here in Southern Illinois. My two congregations, the church buildings themselves, go back to the 1800s. And so we've been here a long time, and we'll talk about kind of the areas that, you have your your town and village that is historically Baptist, and your town and village that is historically Lutheran and things like that. But this kind of what I call American evangelicalism, and formed by all these other Reformed bodies, became very numerous and influential. It kind of overshadowed, and it comes in a lot of practices that Lutherans historically would have not done, namely like the individual cups. And it was actually in one of my congregations that I serve here only recently that under my predecessor, that individual cups were even introduced. It was the common cup only for the great length of history of the congregation. Now there's germs, and especially now with the virus and things like that, those sorts of considerations that have impacted that historically as well. But I think also what you're hitting on here is the theology that you have at work does inform your practice, and your practice does testify or confess something about the theology that you have at work. And so that's why it's very important to be clear on what is it we believe, teach, and confess with regard to these things, because what is it we're saying by some of our practices, and are we allowing certain practices in that are simply, as I highlighted earlier, and as you highlighted really well too, still kind of that thread of Crypto-Calvinism, that it's teaching that actually stands against us. Now, again, I'm not criticizing your pastor because he uses individual cups. I even have them, again, in my dual parish here and so forth, but we can simply talk about the history and development of these things, and also, just have a theological discussion on this that maybe makes us dig into these things and have some consideration about what is our theology and how should that inform our practice and things of that nature as well. And I think that this comes in because this is a really helpful kind of threefold question laid out here in these 3 points of, when we say yes in regards to these things and they say no, well, that may impact then some of the things that we do with regards to this. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think the individual cups is a great example. Like your congregation, my congregation uses both. We're actually sort of coming from a different perspective, though. When I got to my congregation, the congregation I serve now, I would say probably 85-90% of the folks used individual cups. And just by being able to teach on the history of the matter, individual cups, for those who don't know, they started around the 1880s, and it started with groups who did not believe in the bodily presence of Christ. And that's just a historical fact. It started up in, if I remember correctly, upstate New York or somewhere in New York, and they didn't believe in the bodily presence of Christ. They were prohibitionists who thought that the use of wine was sinful, and if you don't believe in the words of institution anyway, why not change the practice to fit your views? And so they said, well, we don't believe that we should use wine, so let's use grape juice. And then they all started getting sick on the use of the common cup, so they went to individual cups. And like you said, now there's the fear of germs nowadays. But if it's the body and blood of Christ, and this is one of the things I try to remind my members of too, and especially I think this is going to be something that we need to be very sensitive coming out of this coronavirus situation. Folks are very understandably going to want to go to the individual cups until the government says, everything is safe. But keep in mind that when we receive the body and blood of Christ, we are not receiving the body and blood of a dead Christ or of a sinful human Christ. We are receiving the body and blood of the risen Christ. We are receiving the holy body and the holy blood of the risen Christ. And sin and death and germs cannot overcome that. And so certainly we continue to use the individual cups in our congregation, but simply by talking about it, now I would think the percentages are flipped in our congregation. I think it's probably 70-75% who use the common cup and 25% who use individual, because you're absolutely right. There's a history of confession there. And without even realizing it, we had adopted some American evangelical practices in the 20th century that we're now starting to learn, wait a second, we don't have to use those practices. We can rejoice in being Lutheran and all those practices that confess, quote, this is my body, this is my blood, for you, for the forgiveness of your sins, and therefore for the strengthening of our faith.
Yeah, and I think you're right. We want to be sensitive to these sorts of things, especially coming out of this this whole situation that is affecting our world right now with the coronavirus, right, and people staying at home and so forth. But it does impact a lot of those sorts of things. I am maintaining the practice of offering the sacrament to those who desire it within the proper number of groups and those sorts of things. Yet at the same time, to be able to minister to my people in terms of the preaching and things of that nature, I'm making use of what KFUO has wonderfully provided me. Audio is just kind of easiest for me as I do my radio show, so I use it also to provide preaching and services for my people as well. But when we come out of this, then we want to remember again, what is our theology, and let that form our practice as we come back to the church. Again, I'm not condemning a single pastor or anything out there in terms of what they choose to do. But for myself, because of my theology and my Lutheran theology of what is significant in the gathering together of the body of Christ to receive the body and blood of Christ, I'm probably more hesitant to make use of some of those exceptional means, like providing an audio service, of course, for shut-ins and things like that. But on a regular basis, I'm not real I don't tend to do that because, again, what is my theology at work here? And so, those sorts of considerations will play into, do we continue these sorts of exceptional measures that we've put in place just for this time because, hey, that was really great. Well, then we could face other issues, which is, again, it's just all a spiritual gathering and things like that. Well, that's not our theology. If you think that you can just sit at home and watch on YouTube or things like that on a regular basis when there's not, exceptional times in place, I would encourage you to talk to your pastor. That's not genuine Lutheran theology. Also, it plays into, and we don't really want to get too deep into this because it's a real raw, sensitive issue right now, but we can clearly confess, that when it comes to the matter of internet communion, that's right. Very testy within our church body right now. Again, when we confess what we confess as Lutherans, that's not a practice that we're going to abide by, even in exceptional times. And so we're more likely to go the fasting route and those sorts of things like that. But again, I'm with you that this is a time to talk about and to teach so that we can have that form and shape our practices, and then also consider in the practices that we have, what does that confess about the theology that we have?
Yeah, no, I sort of, I guess just to summarize this, I sort of view the situation as unique as it is, sort of like when the disciples were in the boat with Jesus. They were afraid that they were going to drown. Jesus first calms the storm, and then, in a sense, he admonishes, lovingly chastises, corrects them. Oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? And really, I think that's sort of a situation that the whole church is going through right now, is that with good Christian love and generosity and goodwill toward everyone, we're going to say individual pastors are going to do what they can, what they think is right to get through this. And other than anything that's completely out of bounds and out of left field, we're going to be patient and loving and understanding. But there will be a time. There will come a time for, if you will, a debriefing where Christ will say to the whole church, "Why did you doubt? And why did you feel the need to change all these things? And how does that affect the life of the church and the practice of the church going forward?" So that time will come. But yeah, this is an odd time, isn't it? It's an odd time.
It really is. And on the matter of time, just to completely sidestepping, kind of go in another direction, we do have a few other things to address here in a few paragraphs that I want to read. And then I think this helps us with that spectrum that we've been talking about as well. So let's discuss that and end the show here. So picking up with paragraph 3, to explain this controversy, it must be noted in the beginning that there are two kinds of sacramentarians. Some are openly crass sacramentarians. They declare in plain, clear words that they believe in their hearts that in the Holy Supper nothing but bread and wine is present, distributed and received with the mouth. Others, however, are crafty sacramentarians. They are the most harmful of all. In part, they talk very fancy, using our own words. They pretend that they also believe a true presence of the true, essential, living body and blood of Christ in the Holy Supper. However, they say Christ in the Holy Supper. However, they say that this happens spiritually through faith. Nevertheless, under these fancy words, they hold precisely the former crass opinion, namely that in the Holy Supper, nothing is present and received with the mouth except bread and wine. For with them, the word spiritually means nothing other than the Spirit of Christ or the power of Christ's absent body and his merit that is present. But for them, Christ's body is in no mode or way present, except above in the highest heaven. They say we should elevate ourselves into heaven by the thoughts of our faith, and there, not at all in the bread and wine of the Holy Supper, we should seek Christ's body and blood. So it's not complete sidestepping here, but go ahead with just about a minute 30 here. Break this down for us as it relates to the spectrum that we've talked about in the theology that plays out in our practice.
Sure. So the crass sacramentarians, this is simply those who say, nope, memorial meal, that's all that it is, right? That's pretty simple and straightforward. Crass sacramentarians have no use for any spiritual eating whatsoever. It's just something that you do because you were told to do it, bread and wine. The crafty sacramentarians, those who think that you're eating spiritually through faith, would be more followers of Calvin, if you will. To his credit, at least Calvin thought there was something spiritual going on. But for him, magisterial reason takes over his interpretation of the scriptures, so that he has to say, if Christ is true man, he's stuck up in heaven. because man can't be in more than one place at one time. And so if he's stuck up in heaven, that his true body and blood cannot be on every altar. And therefore, if we want to feast on him all at the same time, then we have to go up to where he is. Ironically, that gives us the ability to be in more than one place at one time, because we are eating here below while feasting on him above, and supposedly he cannot be here other than spiritually, because he's stuck up in heaven. So the crafty sacramentarians are those who are more trying to use reason to try to figure out, how do I make the sacraments work while still holding on to Jesus being stuck up in heaven and their supposed view of what it means to sit at the right hand of God. This is true for their other understanding, or their understanding of the other sacrament as well. With baptism, it's very much a view of there's something that happens here below with water, there's water being used here below, but really the work is actually being done far away. And I know we're out of time here, but if anybody's ever seen the movie of C.S. Lewis, the Voyage of Dawn Treader, or read the book, there's that scene where Aslan, who represents Christ, comes to save Eustace, who is a dragon at the point, and he comes to save him, and they're standing on an island, and the water is all around the island, and yet Aslan doesn't use the water. He just breathes on him, if you will. So the water is present, but it does nothing. Same view, if you will, of the Lord's Supper. But the bread and the wine are present, but the spiritual eating, faith ascends to where the work really happens up in heaven. And that's the subtle sacramentarian view, where they can say, well, yeah, we believe that Christ is present, just not the way you Lutherans do. It's very crafty, but it's definitely not, this is my body, this is my blood.
All right, that's excellent. Thank you so much to Pastor Mark Bestul. He's the pastor of Calvary Lutheran Church in Elgin, Texas. We thank him for joining us for Concord Matters today and giving us an excellent discussion of the status of the controversy with regard to the teaching on the Holy Supper of Christ. Thank you so much. And if you have a question or comment that you would like to leave for us to address the next time we convene for Concord, you can leave us a message by phone, 314-996-1542, email kfuo@kfuo.org, find us on social media at KFUO Radio. Thank you, dear listener, for stopping by today. You keep safe in this time of shelter at home. And until next time, keep confessing, church.